So you're telling me there's a chance?
Yeah!
You're on the path to MoGraph from School of Motion. Joey here, and welcome to the Path to MoGraph podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about what a career in motion design looks like and how to be successful. I'll tell you how my career has gone, and I'll give you some insights into mistakes I made, misconceptions I had, and how you can avoid some of those pitfalls yourself. So let's dig in. So before we talk about you and what your motion design career might look like, I want to tell you how my career went. And the reason I want to do this is because I had a fairly typical entry into the industry and a fairly typical sort of career path for someone who came into the industry in the early 2000s. Now, if you're coming into the industry now, it is not the early 2000s anymore, and things are a little bit different. So I want to sort of tell you how it worked for me, and then I'm going to tell you how it can work for you, and some of the things that are different, and some of the ways that, you know, the way success gets measured is a little different. Some of the opportunities are different, and frankly, the bar to entry is, I think, a lot lower now. It's a lot easier to break into the industry. All right, so let's start with Joey's story. So I got into video editing and special effects and animation as a kid, as I'm sure a lot of our audience did. Maybe that's how you sort of found School of Motion. Maybe you sort of were looking for some tutorials or something about how to use After Effects maybe. And I ended up studying film and television at Boston University. I was in the film program initially. I decided that the whole, film theory thing and writing and all that wasn't really for me. I was more into the production side. I really liked shooting and editing and making stuff. So after I graduated, I got an internship at a company in Boston that made commercials. And my first job was as an assistant editor, which is sort of the lowest rung of the totem pole that you can sort of be on in terms of post-production. If you haven't heard that term before, post-production just refers to anything that happens after you've shot video. So if you're doing a commercial, you have cameras, you have lights, you have actors and actresses, and you shoot something, that's production. And then you edit and you make visual effects and you add graphics, and that's post-production. So I was an assistant editor, which basically meant that I would get tapes filled with hours of footage, and I would have to ingest that footage into the computer and organize it and label it properly and then give that to my editor, who would then edit it. And it's interesting because that workflow is actually quite a bit different these days because of technology. We don't really use tapes anymore. Everything's kind of shot digitally, and you get a hard drive with your footage on it. But anyway, so I was an assistant editor for about a year and a half. And then I had my first break, which was the editor was laid off. And I was given an opportunity to sort of sub in as the editor for this company as a 23-year-old, well before I had any business calling myself an editor. And the idea was that they were going to hire a full-time editor, but in the meantime, I could sort of sub in and be the editor. And it turns out I was actually not too bad at that. I learned so much just by being thrown into the deep end, basically. And after a few months, they decided to just leave me on as the editor, and they hired a second editor, and the two of us were sort of the editorial post-production team. And it was about that time that I started doing a lot of sessions. And when you're a session, for, if you haven't heard that term before, is basically when your client comes into the room and sits behind you and watches you edit and sort of edits with you. And you're driving the computer and making decisions, but so is your client. And so you have to sort of, be half editor, half sort of client manager and fun person to be around. But it was about this time I was doing lots of sessions and being asked more and more to add graphics or to do some rough compositing, to basically open up After Effects and do some motion graphics, as it was called in those days. And I found that I really enjoyed doing that, more so than I did editing. The thing with editing that I loved was that you were given this footage and you were able to be creative and combine it with music and sound effects and cut it however you saw fit and be extremely creative. But what was even better about doing motion graphics and opening After Effects was that there were no limits to what you could create. As an editor, you're limited by the footage you're given, but as a motion designer, you're only limited by what you can imagine and what you know how to do. And that power was kind of addicting to me, and so I kind of got sucked in through that portal. So I started trying to find opportunities when I was editing to do more and more design and animation, and it turns out that I learned an important lesson at this point in my career, which is that when you work for a company, you don't really have full control over the work that you're doing. I wanted to be learning more After Effects, doing more design, doing more animation, and pursuing that. But the work that my company was doing at the time was primarily commercials and corporate videos, and really what they needed was an editor. So probably 80% of what I was doing was editing, and so I made the very difficult decision about 2.5 years into that gig to quit and go freelance. And freelancing is essentially when you don't have a full-time job and you advertise your services to clients. At the time, all of my clients were local. It was much more difficult to work remotely. Now you can be a freelancer and work only with clients that are in a different country than you. That's actually pretty easy to do now. But back then, I decided to just try and freelance around Boston where I was living. And so I sort of, scraped together the work I'd done over the last 2.5 years. I did a couple of quick little experimental things just so I had some more work on my reel, and I put together a portfolio, which was a pain in the ass to do back in 2005 or 6 when I went freelance. And I just started making phone calls and emailing people and telling people, hey, I know After Effects, I can do motion graphics. And very quickly, I started to get booked. I started to basically be doing design and animation all day, every day, and I did that for the next 6 or 7 years. And in those years, I found myself very often in situations where I had no idea how I was going to execute an idea or a design, how I was going to accomplish what the client was asking me to accomplish. And over again, I used Google, I got on websites, I asked people, and I learned, and I soaked up knowledge like a sponge. And at the end of that, I was actually a pretty darn good After Effects artist. I was a decent animator. I was an okay designer. I knew a lot about how to get work and keep clients, and I was busy all the time. So then I decided, well, I've gotten this far in my career. What's the next step? So what I wanted to do was have a little bit more creative control over the work I was doing and be able to build a team so that it wasn't just me doing work. I really enjoyed working freelance at studios and at ad agencies and some of the other places I would work when I got to work with a team, because I had strengths. I was a strong After Effects artist. I was a pretty good animator, but I was not a great designer. And so the best work that I did during those years was with great designers who weren't great animators. And I wanted to build that for myself. So I partnered up with a couple of editors from Boston who had a successful post-production company. And together, the three of us spun off a business called Toil, which was a motion design studio in Boston. And I ended up running that studio for about 4 years. My title was creative director. And the creative director is sort of the person that interfaces with the clients, kind of pitches ideas to them, manages, the internal team to kind of come up with good ideas and how we're going to execute them. I was also the head animator, and together with my small team that we built over those 4 years, we did a lot of national client work for brands like Saucony Shoes, Subway, Progressive, McDonald's, lots of brands like that. And on paper, everything was a big success. And so that's about as high up in the food chain as you can get in the motion design world, where you are, sort of part owner of a studio. I wasn't actually an owner, but I sort of had a profit sharing deal. I was the creative director. I was the boss. I sort of went from assistant editor to freelancer, working my way up that way, building up my skill set until I had an opportunity to open a studio with 2 partners. And then after that, I started School of Motion. And here we are. So that is sort of like the path that I took to go from zero, being, a student right out of school with very, very limited knowledge. Almost nothing that I learned, that I do now, nothing that I did in most of my career was learned in school. And that's how we're here with you listening to a School of Motion podcast. Now, I want to talk about your career. Now, maybe you're already working in motion design or in post-production or in design or in UI, UX, something sort of tangential to motion design. And the reality nowadays is very different than it was when I started. So when I started, it was, your portfolio was important. But the thing was, people didn't really understand. And when I say people, I'm talking about the average person in, say, the broadcast industry or the advertising industry or the development industry, tech. Those people did not have an awareness of motion graphics and motion design like they do now. And so you had to do a lot more work even to get your name out there and to tell people what it is you could and couldn't do. Nowadays, there's a lot more awareness. Basically, every screen in the world has some form of motion design on it, and even companies like Google and Apple are hiring After Effects artists and motion designers. So really, what you need to do now is to prove you can do motion design. So I mentioned that I went to college for film and television. And, if you listen to the School of Motion podcast, if you hear me on any other podcasts, you will hear that I don't believe you need to go to college for this anymore. Truly. If you're thinking of going to college or art school to learn to be a motion designer, my advice is don't unless money is no object. Because the cost of an education now, at least in the United States, is astronomical, and the quality of education is no better, and in a lot of cases not as good as the education you can get on sites like School of Motion. So the key to getting a gig, full-time or freelance in this industry, is your portfolio. The number one thing that you need to start doing as soon as you feel like you might be ready, that's when you should start doing this. You need to make stuff. So if you go through this course, The Path to MoGraph, and it's interesting to you and you kind of get inspired and you want to try making something, download the 30-day free demo of After Effects and start playing around with it and just make stuff. Get your hands dirty. And I'll tell you, the first few things that you make are not going to be good. But if you keep working at it, eventually they will be good. And let's say you decide to take After Effects Kickstart, Animation Bootcamp, maybe Design Bootcamp. In a year, you can take 3 or 4 School of Motion courses and basically be able to go out and freelance as an After Effects artist. I know it's hard to believe if you're right at the beginning of your journey and you don't know anything yet, but you can learn this stuff really, really quickly. And the truth is, what you can learn in a class is generally enough to get your foot in the door. The real learning, the real growth is going to happen once you start using that stuff for clients out in the real world. You're going to grow super fast. So as hard as it is to believe, if you're starting at ground zero right now, if you apply yourself, take it upon yourself to learn these tools, to learn these skills, and to make stuff with them, and then to put that stuff out and tell people that you know how to do it, in a couple of years, you could be a full-time motion designer, no questions. So here's another thing I want to talk about that's a little bit different now than it was when I started. You don't need permission to be a motion designer. You don't need a degree to be a motion designer. When I started, it was a little bit harder to break in. There weren't as many jobs. Now there are, I can tell you, that there are far more motion design gigs out there than motion designers. Finding good motion design talent is, and I think for the next 50 years, going to be truly a problem for employers. So this is a good business to get into. But again, like I mentioned before, your portfolio is going to be the key to unlocking your career. You don't need tons and tons of connections. Sure, that helps, and you'll make those once you get your foot in the door. But you don't need anybody's permission to set up a website saying, I'm a motion designer and here's my work, take a look at it. Another thing that's changed quite a bit, and this is something that I wish was the case when I was kind of coming up in the industry, is that there's a lot of different ways that success can look. So when I was starting out, success really meant you become the head of a studio. You become a creative director, and you are the one leading jobs and kind of making the big decisions and kind of putting your fingerprint on the work and on the industry. And that, it still exists and is still a very worthy, valid goal. But there's so many other ways that you can be successful now. And, success can mean that you're a freelancer and you only work 6 months a year, because freelancers in motion design can make a lot of money and can charge a really high rate. So maybe that can be one definition of success. There are motion designers now that are using their skills in other ways. There's a great studio in Nashville called IV, and they have built a game for iPhones and iPads that's doing well. Using the same skills, design and animation and technical chops that you use in motion design in a different way to build a game. There are lots of artists out there who have a dream to work in the film industry and to work on film title sequences. So maybe that's your idea of success. Or maybe your idea of success is to get a job at one of the big tech companies and get a really big salary and stock options and great benefits and a 40-hour work week where you can, spend a lot of time with your family. So that's another way success can look. And, today you have all of these options open to you. And I would sort of implore you, even though you may be at the very beginning of your career, to start projecting forward a little bit and just try to put the feelers out, a few years and think about what success might look like to you, because that will affect some of the decisions you'll make as your career progresses. All right, so let's talk about some of the ways that your career can actually look. So you still have the traditional thing, which is you go to work for a studio or an agency, a marketing company, some company that clearly does advertising, explainer videos, corporate videos, things like that, that need motion design. And that's a really great way, honestly, probably the best way to get your start in this industry, especially if you're working somewhere where there are better, more senior, more talented artists than you. It's not an option for everybody. It depends where you live. But if you live in a city that has a motion design studio, that is where I would start. And, the downside to studios is that a lot of times they're small and there's not a ton of room for you to grow and progress in terms of your salary and your position and stuff like that. But you are almost guaranteed to learn a ton. Now, here's another option. I kind of mentioned it a little bit before, but let's dig into it. Studios used to be the only game in town, and now they might be the smallest game in town. A big trend that we've seen at School of Motion is that big tech companies, the companies that are worth $100 billion and have an infinite amount of cash, they are hiring up motion designers left and right and building their own in-house teams. So companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Airbnb, Uber, these gigantic companies have in-house motion design teams. And, the advantage of working at a company like this is, A, you're probably going to get paid way more than a studio can afford to pay you. Because if you think about it, a studio has to sell motion design as a service and make a profit on it. But Google doesn't sell motion design as a service. They use motion design as a marketing tool or a tool to make the user experience of their apps better, things like that. So it's a cost, not sort of a service that they offer. And so they can pay a lot more for it. So that's kind of a good thing, depending on what stage of life you're in, depending on what your goals are. If you want to work on the coolest stuff, that's probably not the place you're going to do it, although a lot of those companies do very, very cool work. And another downside of working there is that you may not be able to show any of that work because a lot of times, especially at a place like Apple, there's non-disclosure agreements, things like that. But that is a definite option that you have now as a motion designer. Now, another option you have, and this is a really cool one that's just growing like crazy, like wildfire, is you can work for almost any company that has any sort of video presence is going to have a motion designer or a full motion design department. Almost every major sports team in the world now has some sort of video production department, and almost all of them will have a motion designer or 2 or 3 on staff. Companies like Red Bull, companies like CrossFit, the UFC, Bose, Nike, they all have in-house video departments. They all have in-house motion designers. And these, you may not get paid as much as if you're working for Google. You may not get quite all the perks, but the stuff you're working on might be really, really cool. If you're working for Red Bull, I mean, this would be cool for me. I'd get all the Red Bull I can drink, I'm assuming. But also, you get to be part of a company that kind of has a cool culture. And, there's probably lots of neat things that happen at a company like that. The work you're doing might be really, really interesting. And they might just be an amazing company to work for. So that's another option available to you that didn't really exist when I started. When I started, companies like that went to ad agencies, and then ad agencies went to studios. And there's this trend now of companies cutting out the middleman and just building their own teams, which is really only going to help the motion designer. Freelancing is still a very valid option, and it's frankly becoming more and more common, which I think is because there's a lot of great information out there now. If you decide you're curious about freelancing, you can check out the Freelance Manifesto, which is a book that I wrote. You can check it out on schoolofmotion.com. It's available on Amazon in paperback and for Kindle, and it goes into the nuts and bolts of freelancing. And so there's a lot of information like that out there. There's a lot of easy tools for invoicing and keeping track of clients and working remotely. And there's lots of companies just all over the world that need motion design that can't afford full-time motion designers. And that sort of area is exploding, and there's just tons of work for motion designers out there. So there's this also huge, fastly growing need for freelancers. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the cutting edge of motion design. This area is still developing. It's going to be developing and morphing and growing and changing for years, but there are some areas of motion design that are kind of right on the bleeding edge that are growing super fast. One huge one is UI and UX prototyping using motion design. And not even prototyping, actually creating animation designed to be used in apps. So there's tools now that will let you animate things in After Effects and then translate that animation into a format that engineers, software developers can use and embed inside of applications. And if you kind of go through the content on School of Motion, if you listen to our main podcast, you'll hear about these tools. And motion designers are now getting hired quite a bit to figure out what happens in this app when I click this button. How do we get from this screen to this screen? All of the skills and tools that we teach at School of Motion work perfectly for that job. And you can imagine the kinds of companies that need that, the big tech companies that pay a lot of money. There's also virtual reality, augmented reality, all the other realities that are coming on the market, and those are also going to need motion designers. Motion design, it's still a field. It's kind of hard to define what exactly motion design is. But if you think of it as the intersection of design, traditional graphic design, and animation, anything with a screen, anything with pixels, frankly, falls under the realm of motion design. And so where motion graphics, the way it was referred to years ago, used to be the domain of things that end up on TV and require animation, now it's anything that ends up on YouTube or your phone or your Magic Leap or your Oculus Rift. That's also motion design. So your career as a motion designer can take you into some of the most interesting parts of high-tech companies and the bleeding edge of technology. And honestly, I'm a little bit jealous of you. If you're listening to this and you're at the beginning and you have a long career, hopefully in motion design ahead of you, you're going to be doing some pretty cool stuff. So I'm going to leave you with this. Our mission at School of Motion is to teach and to support you in any capacity that we can. We spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources to build classes that teach you what you need to know, which is different than just putting stuff on YouTube designed to get clicks and get views. We actually teach you the principles of design, of animation. We teach you the parts of After Effects and of Cinema 4D that you, as a motion designer, will need to know to get hired, to get freelance gigs, to get booked, and to have a long, prosperous career in motion design. We are always here to help out anybody who's interested in this. It literally is our mission. The name of the company is School of Motion. We want you to learn and to be a successful motion designer. And we're always here. If you have any questions, there's a big support link on the site, and it's very easy to get a hold of us, team@schoolofmotion.com. So that's it. I hope this gave you a little bit of an overview of what motion design as a career looks like these days and how it's changed. And hopefully it's also gotten you a little bit excited about the opportunities that are open to you. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the Path to MoGraph. Again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. And that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day.